Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Mamaroneck, New York, just a little bit away, with apologies for not being there in person. I'm not sure whether you would have heard or not, but I did get a positive COVID test just a couple days ago. The good news is that just yesterday I got a negative COVID test, but I think it makes sense to be safe and cautious. And so I'm going to speak with you, unfortunately, over the screen and not in person today. But I do have a full lecture for you, and I want to get started. And when we get back together in person next week, please save your questions for me. I'll be eager to hear what you thought. So let me get things set up here. Take just a second. Hopefully it goes smoothly doing it from home. And I'm going to actually work through a couple lectures on this topic with you this week and next week. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions next week. But I want to think about what's happening in the economy. And when I was with you there last week, we discussed the idea that perhaps there is a competition in American politics right now along two tracks at the same time. A track that is a kind of ordinary track of politics in which people pay attention primarily to their self-interest, relatively narrowly construed, and try to evaluate the current leaders and their party on the basis of how they are doing personally, and that from that perspective, Joe Biden and the Democrats don't look so great. They may look a little bit better this week than last week, but I think many of the factors that are dragging them down will continue to present significant headwinds for them. And that on the other hand, the fact that the Supreme Court has asserted itself so aggressively on a number of extremely important constitutional issues, most importantly, but not exclusively, on abortion, overturning Roe v. Wade, is forcing some Americans to look at the current election cycle in a different way, not just about how the economy is doing or how the Democratic Party and Joe Biden are doing for them, but also about what the constitutional consequences are of returning one or the other of the main two parties to power. And the worry in particular that the Republican Party is in the midst of bringing about a major constitutional transformation that appears to be quite unpopular as far as many Americans are concerned. And so there was some evidence just the last few days with the outcome in the referendum in Kansas, which was designed to make it clear that the Kansas Constitution does not protect a right to abortion. Kansas, one of the most conservative states in the country, resoundingly rejected that referendum. And I think there's a lot of us who are a little bit shocked at the decisive margin with which the referendum was rejected, not only in the somewhat more liberal urban areas, but also in the large rural areas of the state, an indication that even many of the more conservative people in a very conservative state like Kansas are not comfortable with completely eliminating the right to abortion. And so this is a new factor in our politics. I would point out, of course, that Indiana just passed legislation creating a near total ban on abortion. And so these forces will probably continue to compete or jockey for prominence in our politics. Today, I want to focus more on the economy and that side of the picture, and to think about it not only in terms of the current economic data, but also the long-term economic picture, the fact that we have really returned to the levels of inequality that were seen in this society at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I've put on the slide an image from Francisco Goya, which is an image of Goya's impression of inequality in Spain during the monarchy in the late 19th century. And I'm sorry, the late 18th century, actually. No, yes. And the idea that the harms to inequality are not just economic, but also psychological. And that as we come to grips with the idea that the coronavirus is probably not going to be successfully contained anytime soon. The fact that I'm speaking to you from afar is evidence of that, I suppose, that we may return to a coronavirus endemic as opposed to pandemic, but for the time being, it appears we're still in a pandemic. It is certainly possible that there will be new mutations which will render the virus more virulent than it currently is, that this is changing the structure of our economy in a context of already heightened inequality. And so how should we be thinking about the short-term economic data in light of some of the long-term structural developments in the American economy over the last 50 years? So I want to spend a couple days talking with you about that today and next week as well. Before we get there, I need to point out to you, and we spoke a little bit about this last week, but this is a big deal. It appears now with Kristen Sinema on board, Joe Manchin on board, the Senate probably voting any day now to ratify the Inflation Reduction Act, the remnants of Build Back Better. And I think if we remember the historical genealogy here, right? This is a bill that started out as the Green New Deal. And Joe Biden thought that it was bad politics to endorse that title, but actually endorsed many of its provisions and relabeled it Build Back Better. That Build Back Better died and was revived several times. And in its final incarnation, Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer came to an agreement about a week ago, and Kristen Sinema took just a tiny little piece of it out. We'll talk about that in a moment, but has now come on board as well. And it certainly appears that the Democrats are very close to the finish line on not the huge, ambitious legislative agenda with which Joe Biden started his presidency, but still substantial domestic policy initiatives. And in particular, the aspect of this legislation that addresses climate change will be the first substantial environmental legislation in this country in over a generation. And I believe really you've got to go back to 1988 to get similarly ambitious legislation on the environment. And of course, we are in the middle of a climate crisis. We are seeing it here and now in New York. I believe the low last night was around 79 degrees. We're seeing it with massive wildfires out west. Again, we're seeing it with drought conditions covering 3/4 of France, with England having hit its highest temperature by far ever, with forest fires sweeping much of Western Europe, etc. Right? And so this is a genuine crisis. We've talked about this before, and the United States is finally beginning to act to do something about it. And so there are about $260 billion in climate change initiatives in this legislation, electrical vehicle tax rebates, and this is 7,500 for new cars, 4,000 for used vehicles, removing the cap so that all manufacturers get this for all of their vehicles, no matter how many they sell. Tax subsidies to consumers for energy efficient appliances. And I'll just point out to you, I'm speaking to you from home. I recently installed what are called heat pumps here. And these are basically big refrigerator units that transfer the heat outside and bring cooler material inside during the summer, and vice versa, transfer the cold air out and transmit heat inside in the winter. And they are much more efficient than standard natural gas or electric or oil heaters. It could be a huge difference in American energy consumption if not just heat pumps, but a whole new generation of efficient appliances were used in new and existing housing stock. And it appears that the subsidies in this bill will make a big difference in that regard. Tax subsidy to industry to transition to zero emission energy production, right? So this means solar, this means wind, it means other forms of green or clean energy, right? And so really encouraging the energy transition that we are long overdue in bringing about. Penalties for methane emissions if there's leakage. This is in a sense reversing a Trump era regulatory change and putting it now into legislation, giving subsidies to manufacturing industries if they adopt clean practices, setting aside support for low-income communities. And I think this is extremely important. We've talked before about the idea of sacrifice zones, that certain areas and cities have been basically designated areas where industry and garbage processing and transport hubs will be located, and that the result is that the air quality in those areas are off, right? Tremendously dangerous for the health of the residents. Of course, those areas tend to be Black or Latino, poor, and so doing something about environmental justice and the unequal distribution of pollution in our cities is another extremely important initiative. Then Joe Manchin managed to exact certain sacrifices on the part of Schumer and the Democrats. And while they're not happy about this, it does appear the progressives are going along with it. There will be more public auctions of public land for fossil fuel exploration, more subsidies for fossil fuel development, but with carbon capture. And frankly, we'll have to see how this works in practice. The carbon capture technology is very inefficient and expensive right now. Will the fact that there is a subsidy for transitioning coal and oil and natural gas power plants into carbon capture result in greater efficiencies? This is not all that's in the legislation. There's also, and I think this is extremely important, it's why it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, an effort to reduce prescription costs across the board for Americans, to allow the FDA to negotiate on a range of the most popular prescription drugs, to put price caps in place, and to cap the Medicare out-of-pocket expense at $2,000 a year. And then finally, continuing the Pandemic Affordable Care Act subsidies for 3 more years. We put all of this together, and you can see what this looks like in terms of the savings and the spending. You can see that the carried interest charge exemption, which was originally eliminated, but Cinema demanded it be put back in. So there's a little bit of an inaccuracy. I couldn't find the updated diagram for this, but corporate tax enforcement, IRS tax enforcement, the methane fines, the prescription drug pricing negotiation and what that will save the government. All of this amounts to about $790 billion in savings, according to nonpartisan analysis. The spending amounts to about $500 billion, primarily on the energy and climate programs. This is the clean electricity tax credit. This is other climate and energy spending, clean manufacturing tax credits, clean fuel and vehicle tax credits, right? So there's a lot in the environmental portion of this bill. Then the extension of the ACA benefits and the capping of Medicaid prescription cost. And the result is a savings of about $300 billion from the deficit. That's part of what got Manchin to go along with this legislation. And in terms of the climate impact, and this is where I'll just concentrate for a moment, because I think in a sense, this remains the most urgent priority the nation faces, the world faces, right? This is an existential threat, not only to human beings, but to biological life on the planet. And we're finally getting a dose of good news here. And it does look like if all of these policies are implemented, it will put us within striking distance of our 2030 pledges, according to the Paris Climate Accord and the way in which it's been updated in subsequent rounds of negotiations. Not quite to where we're supposed to be, but very close to where we're supposed to be. And I think it's worthwhile remembering when Joe Biden was elected president, there was a real sense of optimism and relief on the part of many climate activists that finally the United States, Europe, and China, the three largest actors in this area, were all going to align in terms of having leadership that really wanted to tackle climate change. And then, of course, Biden got dealt a series of setbacks. But now finally, it does appear the United States is going to do its part and perhaps be able to exert some leadership on this. And we will have to see. News I'm not going to talk about, but with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the Chinese have withdrawn for the time being from negotiations and communication with the United States on the climate. I suspect ultimately that this is nationalist saber rattling on the part of the Chinese, not a serious and long-term policy change. The Chinese are among the worst impacted by runaway climate change. It is in their self-interest to continue to address this problem, and I can't imagine that they will ultimately let Pelosi's visit distract them or derail them from what is extremely important. All right, so having gotten that out of the way, let me now spend a little bit of time looking at the current economic data. And what we saw yesterday was a phenomenal jobs report, something that far exceeded what anyone anticipated would happen in terms of new jobs creation. Basically, more than doubled the number of jobs that economists were expecting. 528,000 new jobs created in July. So please note that's the strongest number since the beginning of the year. And what this means is that we have fully climbed out of this deep job loss hole that the pandemic recession caused. We had lost over 20 million jobs in the spring of 2020. We now have actually regained all of those jobs and added some jobs. And so, in one regard, this is obviously good news for the American economy. It means clearly we are not in a recession. And on the other hand, it is also highly inflationary, right? And so the Federal Reserve, one of the reasons people anticipated that these job numbers would not be so high is because the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates steadily. And the general tendency of higher interest rates is to discourage corporate spending because, right, corporations have to go into debt to create new jobs, new facilities, new infrastructure. And the general impact of higher costs for borrowing money is that corporations tend to spend less. And so the expectation was that jobs would come down. They didn't. This may impel the Federal Reserve to further increase interest rates because this job report, though good news in terms of the health of the economy and perhaps the health of the American worker, is also inflationary. And so it's a very mixed signal. And I want to drill down on this a little bit. Here I'm going to remind you of data I've shared with you before. And I know there's a lot on this diagram. And so I'm trying to give you a bit of a snapshot here, or several snapshots at the same time. And so let's start with the diagram on the far left and just point out that gross domestic product shrunk modestly for the first 2 quarters of 2022. That's what gave us some fear about a recession. And it's a peculiar scenario in which the economy as a whole is shrinking slightly, but job creation is very robust. Again, I think we're seeing something like a permanent pandemic economy take shape. And that means that in particular, some of the service sector jobs in restaurants, in hotels, in entertainment, in transportation, airlines, et cetera, that those jobs are coming back as people are getting used to the idea that the pandemic is perhaps here for good and that they're not going to let it substantially restrict their use of these services. More people are going out to eat, going to the movies, staying in hotels, going on trips. And the result is that those industries are hiring again, even if the economy as a whole is not really growing. The second big picture thing to see here concerns inflation. And as you can see, the US inflation rate, and the inflation rate, frankly, in most of the world is troublingly high. It's very close to 10% now. And although we have robust job numbers, I think it's important to remember that the effect of this inflation, when wages do not keep pace with it, right? So wages are increasing at a modest rate. 4.3% inflation is really increasing at a rapid rate, over 9%. And so once you adjust wages to inflation, wages are actually decreasing by around 3% right now. Um, and the result is that if you calculate how much money families will have to spend this year to afford what they got last year, most families, practically all families, are seeing an erosion of their purchasing power. The average family has to spend $5,200 more this year than last year. And remember, this hits more heavily at the bottom of the income distribution, where although the increase in expense is not as great because they're not spending as much, the proportion of their income that is being eaten up by inflation is higher. And so those who are least well off are, as is often the case, those who are suffering the most from inflation. Um, and then, right, it's worthwhile remembering that among the factors here is that consumer confidence and general confidence in the economy is being eroded substantially by inflation, right? 58% of recent survey people in the United States say that the economy is poor, 29% say that it's fair, only around 10% say that it's good. And so, right, these are the headwinds I mentioned at the beginning. I now want to transition to the longer term picture. And I'm going to reintroduce you to some material and some thinkers that we have talked about together before. I'm going to start with Thomas Piketty, a French political economist, one of the leading economists in the world today, and a member of a team of economists. I think they're up to about a dozen right now who are doing breakthrough work in the study of inequality using tax data, inheritance data, historical data to get a much better historical picture of trends in inequality in the United States and the world. And I want to start with his new book, published just a few months ago, A Brief History of Equality, and a couple diagrams from it. And I've spoken with you in the past about the fact that we're in a new Gilded Age, but I think this data really helps us to see what has happened to the United States in both historical and comparative perspective in the last 120 years. And so let's start with income inequality. And note that what we have here is two sets of data. The black are for the United States, the white are for Europe. And they show the share of income of the richest 10% in both the United States and Europe, and the poorest 10%. And so what you can see is that in Europe, right, the white data, at the beginning of the 20th century, the richest 10% controlled 50 to 55% of the income, and the poorest 10% were getting less than, and I'm sorry, I'm saying poorest 10%. I'm making a mistake. The poorest 50%, right? The bottom half of society were getting only about 10 to 15% of the income, right? So really sharp inequality. This is why we call it the Gilded Age. In the United States, things were only slightly better, with the richest 10% getting 40 to 45% of the income, and the poorest 50%, the bottom half of society, getting around 15, a little bit more than 15% of the income. And you see that this continues pretty much until the Great Depression. And then there's actually this substantial movement towards equality in both Europe and the United States. And at the same time, you see, and I think this is extremely important, that although the United States starts the 20th century being more equal than Europe, by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century, we actually trade places in the United States, although it is becoming more equal, begins to be similar to Europe, and then actually begins to be more unequal than Europe in the early 1970s. That really takes hold in the 1980s. And so please note, right, by the time we get to the 1960s, we have the bottom 50% of society getting around 20% of the income, the top 10% getting only around 35% of the income. And then please note, right, as we then move into the current period, we actually see in the United States a return to the same kind of income inequality that we had in the beginning of the 20th century. All the progress of the 20th century has been erased in the last 40 years. We are as unequal as we were 40 years ago. Please note that that is not true for Europe, that Europe did better in maintaining progressive taxation, unionization, and welfare state social expenditures. And the result is that they are more equal at the period we're in now than they were 120 years ago, more equal by far than the United States, but not nearly as equal as they were 40 years ago. So the Europeans have seen some erosion, but what they've done helps to see how steeply unequal we've become in the United States. And then Piketty asks us to look at a second variable, and he actually thinks the second variable is much more important. And that variable is the variable of property and wealth. And so he points out, look, that if you look at the share of the richest 10% in the United States and Europe, they had, right, around 80 to 90% of the property in the beginning of the 20th century. Again, the United States, well, a little bit less unequal than the Europeans. And then you can look at the bottom 50%. There's also the middle 40% on this diagram. So there's a little bit more information here. And the bottom 50%, basically in both the United States and Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, the bottom 50% owned no property, right? The actual figure is around 2% of the property owned by 50% of the population. And again, you can see, right, as we move across the 20th century, there is some reduction in inequality, not the kind of reduction in inequality that you saw in income, but in particular, right, the share of the richest 10% shrinks from maybe 90% down to maybe 75% in the United States, maybe 60% in Europe. And please note again, right, that Europe starts more unequal and ends more equal than the United States. And we add to that, that in both the United States and Europe, the big story of the 20th century is the creation of a middle class, right? That middle 40% share of property goes from negligible, less than 20%, more like 10%, up to maybe 40% of the property, basically proportionate with its share of the population. The other big story is that the bottom 50% is basically excluded from property. In the United States, the figure in 2020 is basically what it was in 1900. In Europe, the bottom 50% doubles its share of property, but that means it goes from about 2% to 4%. And the reason I introduce this today is twofold. On the one hand, the uh, causal story that Piketty is introducing is one in which the fact that the United States and Europe failed to adequately address property inequality explains why they ultimately failed to address income inequality. That the fact that we left the richest 10% sufficiently wealthy with a sufficient concentration of economic power that they could eventually translate that into social and political power meant that they were ultimately able to undo much of the progressive taxation, that they had still the resources with which over the long term to reassert their political power and to capture key political institutions and undo progressive taxation and other measures, and were in fact more successful in the United States than they were in Europe, in part because the American political system is more easily captured by highly concentrated wealth than are the European states. And so that's one reason to emphasize this. If you want to understand why we have a new Gilded Age, it's because we failed to tackle property inequality. But the second reason to emphasize the property side of the analysis of inequality, economic inequality in the 21st century, is because of the emergence of this new middle class, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. Piketty refers to this as a patrimonial middle class. And what that means in terms of the history of economics is that this is a class that gets its wealth not by earning it, but by inheriting it. And so, to be as clear as possible, at various points in the middle of the 20th century, through the New Deal and other forms of economic policy, we created a middle class, right? The GI Bill would be extremely important in the United States, as would all kinds of federal support for building and acquiring housing, federal mortgage insurance, et cetera. And that the people who managed to make that leap are hanging on. But frankly, the reason they're hanging on is not because, right, they're earning more money, but because they're succeeding in inheriting the property, passing it on generation to generation. And so that the people who are excluded, the bottom 50% of our society, really has no opportunity to move into the middle class. And I think that's just really sobering and really important to underline. The bottom 50% basically own no property and have no prospects of gaining property on the analysis of one of the most important economists of our time. And I think, by the way, most people who study economics agree with this idea. Now, I want to focus for a moment on the stickiness of these problems. And so the way in which they go together as we think through what is it we could do if we wanted to address this. And I want to focus on housing here for a moment. And I'm going to look at the work of Jenny Schuetz now, her book, Fixer Upper, How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. And she pluralizes systems because she points out we don't have a housing system. We have hundreds of housing systems that are local or state-based. The thing to see is that what used to be a housing shortage essentially in the coastal areas, right? In California, in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, has now become a housing shortage throughout the United States, right? And so you can see everywhere that's brown in this diagram or tan has a housing shortage. So it's there in Florida, it's there in Texas, it's there in Washington and Oregon, but it's also there in Utah. It's also there in Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois. And part of what Schutz points out, and you can see it a little bit more precisely in this diagram, right? Whether it's Athens, Georgia, or Hilton Head, South Carolina, or Pensacola, Florida, or Muskegon, Michigan, right? New Orleans, Yuma, Arizona, St. George, Utah, Kankakee, Illinois, right? There are places that you may not have even heard of that have moved from having a housing surplus in 2012 to having a housing shortage in 2019. And on Schutz's analysis, this housing shortage is reducing the GDP, the overall productivity of the American economy by 36%, right? We would have more than a third more income and wealth if we could allow people to afford to move to the cities where the jobs are, right? And so, right, please note, right, part of what we see here is that 50% of Americans are excluded from property ownership. And then what we see is that that exclusion not only makes them poor, makes them economically vulnerable, insecure, precarious, it also keeps them from having economic mobility and physical, geographic mobility, going where the jobs are. And the fact that in California and New York, but also in Georgia, Michigan, Louisiana, and Illinois, people cannot get close enough to where the jobs are to work at those jobs is actually impeding economic growth, right? And part of the problem here that Schutz helps us to see is a problem at the local level, right? And so what this map shows is places where there is a requirement in terms of zoning that new building be detached single family homes. And you can see there are some places like New York and Washington, D.C., where the majority of the housing can be, right, multi-family units. But then there's the rest of the United States, all of the other places where people want to go. And on Schutz's analysis, 75% of urban housing in the United States is zoned detached single family. And so our zoning and our other forms of building code are preventing us from building the housing that we need. And I want to be as clear as possible. If we look at the origins of zoning legislation in the United States, they are directly related to the effort to create residential segregation once the Supreme Court said you can't just segregate your neighborhoods by law, right? And so what various presidential administrations did, this goes back to Herbert Hoover actually, is to say, well, if we can't just say they're white areas and black areas, if we don't want white and black people living together because that's a recipe for unrest and disaster, then let's create zoning, which will have the effect basically of only allowing people with sufficient wealth to live in these areas, right? And please note that basically was a way of segregating without having to explicitly use race in the legislation. And then there'll be these other areas that are industrial and also where the Blacks leaving the South, the Latinos coming to this country will be forced to live because they will not be able to afford the single family detached homes, right? And so there's a bad history here. But even if we abstract from that history for a moment, this is just bad for us economically, bad for us in terms of our level of inequality, but also in terms of our productivity. So now, again, I want to refresh your memory on some stuff we've talked about together before in terms of economic inequality. And just to reintroduce you quickly, we've talked about Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. This is Wilkinson, this is Pickett. They are public health medical researchers in Britain. Richard Wilkinson really pioneered this field with the Whitehall studies, and Pickett has kind of taken the baton from him. Wilkinson is now retired. Pickett has taken over his institute, which looks at the social as well as public health costs of living in unequal societies. Their two best-selling books, The Spirit Level and The Inner Level, try to make the argument that, in a sense, the most important source of public health and social problems in the developed countries in the world today is inequality. It's not diet, it's not drug use, etc. And I also want to just highlight for you again Claude Steele, now the provost of the University of California, Berkeley, and his very important work on stereotype or social evaluative threat, the way in which when you know people are looking at you with a stereotype in mind, that it gets inside your head, it affects your body. In a sense, this helps to explain some of the findings of Wilkinson and Pickett. So to review very quickly, here's the central finding, right? Which is that when we look at a whole range of problems, whether it's how long people live, how well children do educationally, what the rate of infant mortality or homicides or imprisonment is in your society, what level of obesity there is, or trust there is, or mental illness, or social mobility, we see this very powerful correlation. The more unequal a developed society is, the worse off it is in terms of all of these problems. And I just want to point out to you, right, what Piketty's research shows us is that we have become more unequal over the last 50 years, returning to the levels of inequality of the early 20th century. And so as a society, we should expect to be suffering from all of these kinds of problems. And please note that the United States is now the most unequal, right? And that was, in a sense, what Piketty's data was showing us, that there's an inflection point in the middle of the 20th century with regards to income, a little bit later with regards to property, in which the United States became more unequal than Europe on average. And we know how this works, that in a more unequal society, the differences between the social strata, between the different layers of society, are larger, more pronounced. And so when you look up or look down, you see greater difference. If you're trying to climb up, the rungs on the ladder are further apart. So it's harder to move up. But even more important, wherever you are on the social ladder, you know that there are people looking down at you from further apart and people looking up at you from further below. And that makes you more insecure, both about falling down and about the way in which the people above you are evaluating you as inferior because of the degree of inequality. And so then to look at what happened in the middle of the 20th century, to represent it in very simplified terms, we squashed the pyramid, right? And so the distance between the layers became less, the social evaluative threat became less as well. When people looked up, looked down, there was less difference, and so less sense of vulnerability to being stereotyped, to be evaluated based on the markers of social success or failure. The way in which uh, this is expressed by Wilkinson and Pickett is, I think, very clear. There's a naive view of income inequality, that it only matters if it creates poverty or if the income differences seem unfair, and then a more accurate view that their research reveals. Inequality brings out features of our evolved psychology to do with dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority. That affects how we treat each other and feel about ourselves. Inequality increases status competition and status insecurity. It increases anxieties about self-worth and intensifies worries about how we are seen and judged, whether as attractive or unattractive, interesting or boring, etc. Right? And so to be as clear as possible, right? The new data that I was just showing you, data about inflation and how it's eroding purchasing power and wages, data about job growth, occurs in this context of greater inequality that is not just related to the short-term data, but has to do with long-term trends that have been going on in the United States and Europe for really half a century now. And that these trends can be captured in a basic sociological, what I consider to be practically an iron law, which is that increased scarcity increases competition, increased competition increases scarcity, right? And we've discussed this together before. The basic idea here is that in order to decrease scarcity in a modern complex society, we need to cooperate, we need to work together, we need to provide social security benefits in terms of healthcare, in terms of property acquisition, that can only be provided collectively. But when we feel scarcity, we fall back into a mode where we're not concerned to provide goods for each other, only to take care of ourselves. And the issue there then, for instance, has to do with housing, right? Why is it that in 2022, 75% of the housing in the metro areas in the United States is zoned for single family? This is a classic not in my backyard kind of scenario in which people are saying, yes, we need more affordable housing, but please don't build it by me, right? That might diminish my property value, and I'm already feeling kind of insecure. That might decrease the tax base and lower the educational quality of the school that my children attend. And it's a competitive society. I want to do everything I can to advantage my children. And it is understandable, in a sense, why people think in those terms, given the level of inequality and the level of scarcity and the level of competition in 21st century America. But this is something we have to work to correct together. The fact that The Democrats have had some breakthroughs legislatively, may do some stuff to contain prescription costs, to make people better able to afford the Affordable Care Act. That job creation continues is not sufficient, obviously, right? But it begins to perhaps pave the way for making the argument that more needs to be done. To return to the analysis of inequality against which we have to situate all of the current data, here's a quote from Wilkinson and Pickett's most recent book. The more hierarchical society is, the stronger the idea that people are ranked according to inherent differences of worth or value, and the greater their insecurities about self-worth. Irrespective of individual differences in skills and abilities, in such countries, social position is taken even more as indicating their worth, sorry for the typo, as superior or inferior. Inevitably, this exacerbates social evaluative threat. That's right, Claude Steele's category, and people's status anxieties. Social comparisons become more fraught, increasing insecurities and self-worth. Everything from physical attractiveness and intelligence to leisure activities, skin color, aesthetic taste, and consumer spending take on greater meaning in terms of rank and worth. And please remember, right, in this context, I just showed you that the average family in the United States is going to have to spend $5,000 more in 2022 than it spent in 2021 in order to have the same bundle of consumer goods. And let us not forget that consumer goods, some of them, yes, are food, rent, transportation, medical expenses, right? Things that are essential and impossible to do without. But on the other hand, some consumer expenses, phones, TVs, computers, the kind of automobile, the kind of clothes you get, are related to status marking, right? Do you have the latest, newest phone? Do you wear good clothes, etc.? And that in a highly unequal society, many people feel impelled to continue to shore up their status, even when it involves making stupid economic sacrifices, right? And so this again is part of the overall picture. Let me conclude actually, am I running out of time? Yes, I am, with a little bit of different information. And this is about stress, right? And this actually goes back to Wilkinson's original Whitehall study. And what this shows is, and I think it's quite clear, he looked in Whitehall, in the public bureaucracy, in the national government in Britain, at the level of work-related stress that people were experiencing on a daily basis. And one of the things he focuses on is inescapable subordination. If you have to go to work every day in order to support your family, in order to sustain yourself, and if you in work have no autonomy, you're basically at the mercy of a boss who tells you what to do, and you've got to satisfy him to keep your job, you will experience high stress. And what he showed is that independently of all other health factors, high stress is strongly correlated with mortality, with increased risk of death. And this has been, in a sense, the foundation for all the subsequent research. And now we see, right, that living in a more unequal society increases social stress. And I want you to look at this for a moment. What this shows is that in countries with high inequality, right? As compared to countries with low inequality or medium inequality, there's an overall trend. People who are in the lowest income group have the highest level of stress. But please note, in a highly unequal society, the people in the highest income group, the top 10%, have about the same level of economic stress as people in the bottom 40% in a medium income inequality society, and people in the lowest 10 to 20% in a low inequality society. And so the inequality in our society is bad for everyone. It is inducing stress, even for the people who do best off, who have the highest incomes, the most security, the least precariousness, because they're still feeling the social evaluative threat from living in a more unequal society. And so as we transition next week into thinking more about the details of the pandemic economy and what it's doing to American jobs, American income, inflation, housing, etc. I want you to have this perspective in mind that we have become a more unequal society, and that inequality is not just creating economic vulnerability at the bottom, it is creating overall levels of competition and stress all over the economy, all over our society. This is then what we have to reckon with as we think about what's coming in 2022 in terms of elections, but also as we think about the policy agenda for the United States. I look forward to seeing you back in person next week. Have a good week. Please take care of yourself. Bye, everybody. Thanks.